Welcome to episode 89 of the Bandhive Podcast.
You're listening to the Bandhive Podcast, the number one online resource for DIY bands to learn about the music business and touring. If you want to turn your band into a lean, mean touring machine, you're in the right place. Now, let's get this show on the road.
It is time for another episode of the Bandhive Podcast. My name is James Cross, and I am very, extremely excited and happy to have back my favorite co-host, Matt Hose of Alive in Barcelona. You just got back from the studio after, like a month on the road, going to see family, be in the studio, all that good stuff, and I can't wait to hear all about it. But first, Matt, how are you doing today?
You know, James, if there was any way that I could be doing better, I wouldn't know what it was. It's a beautiful morning here in Colorado. The weather is gorgeous. I'm starting off the morning right with the podcast, and I got my cup of coffee. My kids are happy. My wife's happy. So I've just had a nice long break from real life, and now I get to jump right back into it. So eager and excited.
Yeah, well, man, that is great to hear. And if the weather holds out, we will have a wonderful day here as well. It's supposed to be 70 and cloudy with a chance of rain.
Sounds perfect.
Fingers crossed we don't get rain so I can go work a baseball game tonight.
Ooh, there you go.
Yeah, man. Well, like I said, it's a pleasure to have you back, and I am excited to talk about today's topic because I thought, what better to talk about than what you learned while you were in the studio this past month?
Yay. Studio time.
Oh, yeah. And, this is something we've talked about before is tips to go into the studio and all that kind of stuff. But it was a more abstract thing because it wasn't right after you had been in the studio. So just jumping right into things here. When you went into the studio, how do you mentally prepare for that experience?
Oh, well, for me, I'm a little bit different than a lot of people. If you talk to most musicians, everybody's like super gung-ho about going into the studio. Everybody's always like, oh, yeah, man, we're going to go record all these new tracks. I call it the dreams of grandeur. It's like the same problem you run into when you're in like high school and middle school and you have to like write a book report. And in your mind, you're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to write about this. And I'm going to write about this. And this is going to be awesome. And I'm going to tie this in here. And then like you get like a half a paragraph in and you're like, wait, what was I going to write about? You kind of like start to lose focus, or, you just had this like perfect plan for how everything was going to be laid out. But when the rubber meets the road, it's a little bit, worse for wear. So for me, I am one of those people who does not enjoy the studio. So it's kind of a fresh perspective for all of you listeners out there. The studio is not always wonderful. I personally get a severe amount of anxiety every time I go into the studio. And I hate it. I really, honestly, if there's a perfect word to sum up how I feel about going to the studio, it is hate. I love writing music. I love getting a polished product at the end. I even enjoy finding places to put the bells and whistles for post-production and things like that. But the actual act of tracking drives me up the wall. Now, I've met people who are like me, where they're like, oh yeah, I really don't like the studio. But I've met infinitely more people who are like, can't wait to get into the studio, can't wait to do this. And I couldn't tell you if it's a common trait amongst people who have anxiety or if it's a common trait amongst singers. But for me, it's a combination of both. My anxiety can get pretty crippling, and it's nothing even really directly music related. I mean, it is obviously because the whole nature of me being in the studio is music related. But my anxiety really comes from the nature of I am a member of a band. I am one piece of the puzzle. And the one really tough thing about being a singer is that you're the cheerleader for the band. So you can listen to like the coolest music ever, and a bad singer will come in and totally ruin a project for you. Like the band Atreyu, in my opinion, is a perfect example of this. Atreyu has always written like pretty cool music, and their singer's voice is terrible. Now, it's worked for them, and they've been able to have like a nice long career of success, and I hope that they continue. But for me, when I hear that guy's voice, I'm like, man, there's like a billion other people who would have been a better vocalist for this. And for me, I guess since I have the benefit of sitting on the outside listening to other people's music and making those types of judgments, I also think about other people sitting on the outside of my music making those judgments as well. And so a lot of the time it can become really nerve-wracking because it's like, oh, is what I'm going to sing, is this really going to, is this going to represent everybody in the band? Is this really important to all of us? And so when that anxiety starts to set in, it's really hard. Not only do you have to get in there and play your parts perfectly, but then on top of that, you're now fighting against your own anxiety. So like for all of our listeners who kind of experience the same thing, for me, I found the most useful thing was making sure that you have demos. And I know we've talked about demos repeatedly, but there's something that you can't ever hear when you don't record a demo. Because when you are recording in the studio, you are in the booth and your producer is in the control room and they get to hear what you sound like recorded. It's not the same as what you hear in your ear while you're singing or while you're playing. Your brain will connect some dots naturally. It's kind of what brains do. They're massive computing organisms that allow you to connect dots in certain areas, and some of the time those dots will be connected in your ear. And so you'll be singing something and you'll be like, man, that sounds so good. And it might be on time and it might be in key. But when it's played back, it's like, wow, that doesn't sound very good. What's it missing? That's something I feel for me as an artist. That's what we always listen for whenever we go back to listen to our stuff to figure out if more needs to be added or if things need to be changed is what's missing. A finished product will sound finished, whereas an empty product will sound empty. And a lot of the times I say it's like you don't know what's not there unless it's not there. You pop in a super high quality record and you don't realize that there's like 7 vocal parts during the verses. You just don't know that because these producers are so good at what they do. It's like, okay, yeah, you're going to sing this in this register. And then I want you to sing it 1 octave higher, but I want you to sing it quieter. And then I want you to sing it 1 octave lower. But when you sing it octave lower, that's going to really muddy it up. So I want you to smile while you sing it. Now, these are concepts that like a lot of people who haven't been in the studio repeatedly don't really understand. There are lots of little phonetic tricks and things that you have to do. Like you can tell that I'm smiling right now. It makes me sound a little bit more like a sociopath. But when you're singing and you're smiling, it will actually bring in some brighter tones to what you're doing. And it'll also help you enunciate your words a little bit better. And so things like that, or it's like little tips and tricks of being in the studio, things where like if I was sitting at home in my living room singing, would it still sound good? Yes. Would somebody sitting in the room still be able to appreciate it? Yes. But when you are going to the studio, when your goal is to like record your perfect performance perfectly, that's really what you're trying to do, is get everything that all of the emotion that you want to have captured, all of the right notes, all of the perfect pitch and timbre, the right emphasis, that all needs to be done in the studio. And so sometimes what does that look like? Okay, go ahead and track that again. Okay, go ahead and track that again. Okay, go ahead and track that again. Even if you did it perfectly. Because you're not just looking for perfect pitch or perfectly on time. One of my favorite sayings from one of our producers is, and has always been, he said it to us the first time I ever went into the studio. He said, doesn't matter. You cannot auto-tune attitude. And I was like, man, that is so good. Like, it's more important for you to make sure that you have your emphasis and your panache and your personality in your music than even for you to have a take that is perfectly on pitch. Because there's a lot of really awesome programs that can pitch correct you. Now granted, you're probably not going to be using that if you're competing at this level of the game, or you're using it for polish up work.
Or your Machine Gun Kelly.
Right. Or that's your style, like if you go and listen to like early Justin Bieber compared to late Justin Bieber, it's like, wow, this stuff early has like no auto-tune, no melodyne, nothing. And then like this later stuff, it's like, no, this is very obviously pitch corrected, but there's a certain amount of pitch correction that's considered socially acceptable in music. And, thanks to like T-Pain making it more popular, there's lots of artists who do it, and sometimes it's tasteful. And James, you probably know a lot more of those types of tricks of the trade than a lot of people, just because that's all done on the production side. But absolutely, it's your personality. Your personality is supposed to shine through on your music. That's really what you're selling when you sell music. Anybody can write a 4-chord song with a lead over it Music theory is music theory for a reason. This is coded music law. Like, it doesn't matter. When you play a 1-5-3, that sounds pleasing to the human ear 100% of the time. Now, there might be people who who don't like popular music, and that's fine. That's personal preference. But if anybody ever tells you that pop music does not sound pleasant in their ear, they're lying to you. It has to. So, like, when you have things like music theory, you can go in and you can learn all these things and you can write a song, and for some reason, it still might not get popular. Well, how come? Well, it doesn't get popular because it doesn't have your attitude. Or maybe, there might be a multitude of reasons, but I guarantee you that the more attitude you have in your record, the more marketable it is. The new Olivia Rodrigo, I believe, she's killer. And if you listen to the emotion that she has in her songs, she's got that Driver's License song where it's just very like drab and sad. And you can tell that she's sad when she sings that song. And then she has that other song where it's like way more upbeat, kind of sounds like Paramore meets Taylor Swift, but she just rocks it. And you can tell that she's angry. She sounds good, but more importantly, she sounds like a badass. She sounds like she's like, doesn't matter what happens. I'm a champion. And that, you can feel those vibes coming off of her. That, to me, you can't auto-tune attitude. And so when going into the studio, it's like when you have to like fight against anxiety, when you have to fight against stress, when you're sitting there in the booth and you're like, okay, I've got to sing this perfectly. I represent everybody. It's really easy to kind of like forget to put your personality into things. Don't forget that. Don't forget to be yourself in the studio. Don't let anxiety or stress or anticipation really like lead the way for what it is that you're doing. Because this right here, like when you're in the studio, that's when you're cut and print. That's when it's time for you to shine. That's when it's time for you to be like, oh, this is what we've worked towards. I got to put out something that people are going to love. And how do you do that? Well, you start with attitude. If this is music that you're truly proud of, when you wrote it, you had attitude, then that should be easy enough to get in, but it's difficult for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to add to something there. Back on episode 86, part 1 of 6 COVID takeaways for all musicians, where we had my friend David Ryan Olson of the Music Business Mindset podcast here. He's a good producer. And one of the things that he touched on in that episode is when you go into the studio, just go in and play or perform with confidence, because recording is cheap. Like the actual, if you have to do another take, that's cheap. I'm not saying the whole day in the studio is cheap, but that section. So play with confidence. And if you are going to mess up loud. Like that's the thing. I don't know how many takes Olivia Rodrigo had to do to get her vocals spot on. But like you were saying, in that one song, she's angry. I'm sure that emotion, she was putting 100% into it, knowing that, hey, if I mess this up, who cares? We can do another take. In the big picture, it's better, since we're paying all this money to go into the studio, it's better to mess up loud a few times than be timid and just tiptoe up to the mic and whisper.
Absolutely. It kind of brings me to my next part where criticism. Criticism is an integral part of being in the studio. Now, for anybody who's in a band, maybe some of you have a bandmate who is like super anal about how your music is. Maybe you're that person in your group that's like, this has to be perfect, and which is good. Don't crucify the perfectionists, because they are your greatest asset. But it is important to remember that criticism is going to come. Nobody likes criticism. So if you can take it constructively, apply what they're telling you. And the thing is, it doesn't hurt to try. Keep in mind that it doesn't hurt to try while you're in the booth. We just recorded 3 more songs. And we didn't have 100% of the vocal parts ironed out. We didn't have all the harmonies ironed out or anything. And so while I'm in the booth, I have my producer and I have Jesse sitting there saying, hey, why don't we try this? And for me, it's like, okay, I have to go with the flow. I could sit there and be like, oh, I didn't write that, so I'm going to be upset. It's like, no, just curb that crappy attitude and curb the anxiety. Realize this is a project. This is something you all work on. And it's okay for more than just one of you to be proud of it. And so, like, if there's certain things, like, for instance, when we recorded one of these songs, I had written a line a specific way. I wanted the last word of the line to fall on the downbeat of one of the next bar. So I recorded it that way. Then Jesse heard it and he's like, I think we should try it so where it finishes before that first bar. So I said, okay. it's going to sound bad that way, but okay. And so we did it a couple times. He liked it at first and he said, okay, cool. Well, we hadn't tracked the chorus yet. It was like the line leading into the chorus. So then when we went in and tracked the chorus with everything there, it sounded off. It sounded weird. And so he said, you know what, Matt, you're right. It sounds better when it's on the downbeat. So let's go back and change that. And honestly, we probably made more ground just recording it twice than had I tried to fight with him. And then on top of that, he would have had a bad taste in his mouth. He would have been left with this like, man, what if we did this? It could have sounded better. I would have been like, man, I can't believe he wanted to go away from this when this obviously sounds better. Or you could try both things, figure out which objectively sounds better. And it was great because we recorded both of them. And my producer was just like, yeah, this one sounds better. It was like, okay, cool. Everything worked out nicely. No emotion needed to be, involved with the bandmates. And on top of that, we were able to get like this third party objective opinion outside looking in saying, oh, if I were listening to this song, I would think this sounds like a more polished, better product. So like that criticism, a lot of the time it saves you. Going back to that dream of grandeur, it's like we think that everything's going to be perfect. But in reality, it's like, dude, utilize your bandmates. Utilize the fact that they care about this project too. Utilize the fact that they have also listened to music their entire life. Utilize the fact that they care so much, hopefully you have bandmates that care enough about what you're doing that they're going to sit there next to the, like I've heard Jesse ask our producer before, he's like, does this bug you that I just like sit next to you the entire time? He's like, honestly, I wish more people would do it. He's like, it is frustrating at times because like, if you don't know what's going on and you're sitting there, you're like, well, are you the little annoying kid being like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? What's this button do? That's not helpful. But if you learn enough about music production and you can say like, for his particular, his voice in this part, when he keeps singing that, it just sounds a little too wet to me. And then people are like, all of a sudden, it's a total paradigm, like James, if you had somebody say that to you, how would you feel?
I'd be like, okay, let's see what we can do.
Well, and you would feel like they're more involved in their process. It might be a little bit more work for you, but I would be willing to say that the work that you put into it would be a little bit more fulfilling to get out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's ultimately the end product. If that's better, it's worth it. Like I remember the first time I worked with a band where I made a suggestion and they didn't fight it. And they're just like, yeah, let's try it. And that made it so much easier for me to bring up other suggestions during that session. And working with that artist was easier than any of the other bands I'd worked with before where every suggestion was like an argument where it's like, no, like this will be better. Let's just try it. And if we don't like it, we can undo it. It's Pro Tools. It's not like it's committed to tape. It's Pro Tools. We can hit Command Z. And having that environment where it's an open discussion both ways between the artist and the producer or engineer or whoever you're working with, having that open communication channel is so wonderful. And like, I don't even know if we ended up using my idea anymore. I just remember that they were open to that first idea. So I brought up way more ideas in that session than I would have with other artists who were argumentative about it. And so because of that, the final product was better because the band was opening to, it goes back to the constructive criticism you mentioned. And it wasn't even criticism. It was just like, hey, like, what if we add this little guitar part here? I think I was telling them to try adding some octaves or something.
Just something that's going to make it a little bit more full, right? A fresh perspective. And that's the most important thing is if you can go into the studio ready to take on a fresh perspective, in your mind, it's like, oh, all of our stuff's set in stone. Now we're going to go print it. It's like, well, no, all of your planning is done. Your demos and stuff like that, everything is still subject to change. Like you might get in there, you might record something and you're like, I don't like that guitar tone. I See Stars. I can't even remember what record it was. Maybe it was 3D, but I See Stars recorded an album called 3D, and the guitar tech / producer who did all the tracking and got all the tones for the record, it took him 3 days to find the guitar tone for the album. 3 days of moving his amp around, changing different little tiny tweaks and little tiny subtle nuances about it to get this perfect tone. And then when they sent it off to their mixing engineer, he turned the guitars way down in the mix. And I remember talking to him about that and how upset he was. He was like, dude, I should have just used a stock plugin. Like if they were just going to turn all, the whole mix down. And then after the fact, when I talked with those guys about it, they were like, oh yeah, we actually really enjoyed like the guitar tones and we didn't like how much they got turned down in mixing. And it was like, man, these were guys who were very obviously a part of the tracking process. But then like when it came to mixing and mastering, it was like they didn't go with somebody who was ingrained in the process, which was like having that producer there was a change in paradigm where it was like, oh, dude, if we're going to take 3 days to find a guitar tone, like these are people who care about what their music sounds like. I mean, that's insane. 3 days to find a guitar tone. Like, you don't hear stories like that too much anymore because most bands don't have the budget to go and, to have 3 days in the studio finding a single guitar tone. And so, like, find guys that know how to do this stuff. Take that, like you're saying, it's not even criticism. It's like, hey, believe it or not, I also have listened to music my whole life and I have heard other bands do this and that makes products sound better. And you don't have to take the advice, but in the end, if it's something as simple as saying yes to like one thing, and even if you don't use it, there might be 10 other things that leads to where it's like, oh, I didn't like the first thing, but these other like 7 definitely make our album better. In turn, it makes the entire experience better for everybody. The people walk away going, man, this is some new, fresh aspect to my music. The producer walks away going, man, I'm really happy that I helped in that project. I know if I was recording a band, if I just tracked all of their stuff and mixed and mastered it, that would make me excited. But if I gave them my opinions and they used those, that would make me even more excited. There's something really magical about having a producer who is just on fire about your music as well. And so like, if they're willing to give you criticism, if they're willing to like tell you things while you're in the booth, like stand on your tippy toes. You're like, what? Oh, stand on your tippy toes while you track this next part. It's like, what do you mean? It's like, oh, well, that'll just help you hit the high notes. You're like, how does standing on my tippy toes help me hit the high notes? It's like, oh, don't know. But psychologically it does. And like, sure enough, you try it and you're like, holy cow, that's the weirdest thing ever. And I don't know what it is about tightening every muscle in your body and standing on your tiptoes to hit those high notes helping, or to smile and having that make your enunciation better, or breathing heavily while you track your vocals. So that way the mic captures some of your breathiness and your airiness. A lot of these are tricks and tips that like you as an artist won't discover because you don't spend enough time tracking things. These are things that producers learn. These are things that producers are like, oh yeah, no, we need this to be brighter. Like I literally had my producer tell me, he's like, what did he say? He's like, come 3 inches closer to the mic and use more breath, but sing lighter, more of a whisper harder, but with more breath and 3 inches closer to the mic. And I'm just like, what? A lot of what you're doing in the studio, it's not perfect pitch and perfect time. It's enough breath and it's the distance from the microphone and it's your inflection when you say a word and it's like how breathy your layers are. For one of my songs, I sang a normal line. And then after that, I sang an octave. And then after that, I whispered that same octave. And if you were to listen to that soloed, whispered octave track, it would sound like a squeaky mouse. You're like, it doesn't sound pleasant by itself. But when you add it as a layer and you mix it in and you drop it down in the mix and you stuff it up real high, back behind everything else, and you're like, wow. People don't like music. People like noises. That's what they really like. Music production is the bells and whistles. If you were to go watch a movie without the post-production explosions or without the perfect overdub, the movie would be laughable. If you're unsure of this, go get on YouTube and watch any movie with a laugh track. There's sad movies on there with laugh tracks. I actually, even just earlier on this morning, I saw there's a movie where Bruce Lee fights Chuck Norris. And in the scene where they're both taking off their robes to fight each other, somebody overdubbed with like just some like sensual type music, and it totally makes the entire thing feel different. So, it's like, oh, they're taking off their clothes to now this sensual music instead of taking off their belts to fight each other to the death. It's like, okay, these little subtle nuances, you don't realize how much they kind of control your emotion and what you're thinking. Music is super, super powerful. That's why people like Hans Zimmer and Steve Jablonsky are like the only names that you ever see on like movie soundtracks, because these guys literally know so much about music and about just the individual note. It's like, oh, if I just play this one note for a long time, that's really going to make them anxious. And they have these like tools and tricks. They know the subtle nuances like the back of their hand. And so like, if you get some awesome producers that know things like this, or where it's like, oh, this might be better if you don't You don't want to resolve on that note, or you do want to come down on the downbeat of 1. Having those producers who give you constructive criticism, who know enough about their craft and who are really on fire about your project, if you have that combination of things, it's like, don't ever go to anybody else. If they give you a good product, like, they're a part of your team. And just like you would respect your drummer's opinion or your singer's opinion or your guitarist's opinion, you should also respect your producer's opinion. Because the more excited they are about your product, guaranteed the better product you're going to end up getting. And it's also going to curb some of those things like anxiety and just the anticipation or your nerves, or maybe you're somebody who feels a burden of having too much on your own shoulders. And then it's nice to just have like somebody else give their opinion. And then you're like, sweet, thank goodness. I have a billion other things to worry about. I don't want to worry about whether this should come in on 4 or on 1.
2 things. Well, first of all, a second ago, you were talking about how composers know where every note should go. And I want to just point out how important every note is. You don't want to have too many notes. You don't want to have too few notes. You want to have just the right amount of notes in just the right place. And kind of as I don't know if this is proof, but an example of how one note can matter, the G at the beginning of Welcome to the Black Parade.
Oh, yeah.
You hear that one note.
Bum, 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 bum. Yep.
And you know what song that is. Just that one note.
Or how about the intro piano note to The Reason by Hoobastank? Dun, 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 dun. I mean, those simple things, it's just like your brain is so programmed to that. David Gilmour is the master guitar player who probably could play just as fast as Yngwie Malmsteen and Steve Vai and Joe Satriani and John Petrucci. He probably could play 23 notes a second. But you know what else he can do? He can shut up. He can stop playing the instrument. He can literally say, this 30-second guitar solo is going to be 6 notes. And you get to the end of that and you're like, that was gorgeous. Beauty does not need technicality. Technicality does not need beauty. They're not mutually indistinguishable from each other. It's not, they're not opposites. It's like Mark Twain used to say, don't use 5 words when 3 words will do. And I think the same thing goes for when you're going into the studio. It's like, if you're going to play 3 notes and that's going to sound just as good as you playing a 10-note solo, why go to the extra work? And maybe there's a place for it. Maybe if they're interchangeable, then maybe there is a reason for it. Maybe one fits your style a little bit better. But the point is like the options are there. And so like, even though you're going into the studio with your whole plan laid out, you have to have an open mind. That's hard. It's important though. I mean, if not everybody's good at taking criticism. As a matter of fact, most people aren't. Not everybody's good at changing things last minute. Especially in music, we practice things over and over and over again, and we build up a muscle memory. So then what happens when you're trying to change that muscle memory into something else? And I've even had my own producer say it before, where like, he's recording me and his wife is standing right behind him, and he's just having me do the same thing over and over again. Oh, no. And I actually heard her go like, Jimmy, like, this seems mean, what you're doing to him. She like literally thought that what he was doing was mean because I was having trouble getting the vocal part. We had changed the vocal part while I was in the booth. And so I'm like trying to overcome my muscle memory. And Jimmy just said, he's like, no, he's killing it. It's just that he's trying to overcome muscle memory. And he was 100% right. And then I did it a few more times and then eventually got it right. We used that melody line and everything was way, way, way better. So like, there are things that like on the outside looking in, you might be like, oh, this is bad. Like, this is harsh. This is like going to the studio. Oh man, these producers, it was only negative. They made us change our music. It's like, no, dude, there's no producer alive that wants to put out a bad product. You guys are in this weird limbo area where like you're at the mercy of how good the music that's brought to you is written. Some producers are made by the fact that they produce good artists. It's like they're good at their craft. And then they produce artists that know how to write music. Boom. What a cocktail for success. Then there's producers who are really good at their craft that don't get the pleasure of producing good artists. And you can still tell that their work is good, but it's still harder for them to compete because they're not getting these giant label budgets and they're not getting these, massive record contract deals where it's like, oh yeah, we're going to end up sending 5 artists from our label. Joey Sturgis, prime example. He recorded like 2 albums. It redefined the metal industry and the hardcore industry. And then the following year, every single major label artist that played hardcore music released an album with Joey Sturgis. Everyone. And then lo and behold, then the bands that did it first, Attack Attack and Devil Wears Prada, neither one of them went back to Joey Sturgis after that because they realized that everybody in the industry had the same tones, the same tricks, so to speak. Then they released, I believe it was the Dead Throne album. Devil Wears Prada released Dead Throne, and it was a lot more raw. And in my opinion, the production quality was not as high, it wasn't as hi-fi as Roots Below, but it was great. It was different. It was fresh. And it was something that was like, oh, for the last, 3 years, the industry has been oversaturated with all of these massive cymbal swells and giant snare drums that literally sound like they're in the world's largest auditorium, which, don't get me wrong, for like how big you wanted your metal music to be, that sounded really good. But when everybody did it, people just started begging for something fresh. And so it was like having different producers, James, I know you've talked about, having different audio engineers, different trackers, different mixers, different masters, just to get more people involved in your project. But on the production side, it's like you guys are lucky if you get artists who are open-minded, who are humble about their music, who respect what you have to bring to the table. As an artist, I do not go to a producer simply because of the gear they have. And if I do, that's a fool's errand. I have heard some of the stuff that Paul Levitt has tracked on tape, and it's phenomenal. That does not come from the gear that he has. That comes from the experience that he has. I have heard people that have the best gear in the world, and I've listened to their finished products, and I'm like, that's okay. Or I've heard songs where I know that there's like over $100,000 in an account specifically budgeted for this song, and I hear it, and I'm like, that's maybe like a $5,000 recording. And so having people that are ingrained in your team, you really want, you guys are integrated with each other. You're bringing them business. You want to write the best music for them. They want to do the best production for you. A rising tide raises all ships. You want your producers to be busy. You want to make your producers money. You want to bring them business. So listen to what they have to say. To be honest, producers probably listen to a hell of a lot more music than musicians do. I heard it said one time, I asked a producer to our very first EP we ever recorded, I said, what's your favorite band? And he said, I don't even know. I said, oh, really? How come? He's like, well, does a chef go home and cook dinner for his family at night? He's like, I just don't know that I have a favorite anymore, or that I even know what I listen to for pleasure, because my whole life is music. If you're going to be working with somebody whose entire life is music, then cling to that person, make sure that they love what they do, and integrate them into your project. If you're going to them for production, that's what your goal is. It's not about their gear. It's about them being a part of what you're doing for the long haul.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the ear, not the gear, is a common saying in the audio world. And I want to kind of tie together, I think, 3 different points you made there. So the first one being, yes, pick a producer. The second one, splitting up the duties, like you said, that I refer to all the time, which is very true. And then the third one is being open to constructive criticism. And I want to turn that around a little bit and say also be open to giving constructive criticism. Because like your example with I See Stars, if the band had just requested a revision and said, hey, the guitars are a little low in the mix, could you bring them up, please? They probably could have solved that. And there have been times where in the past, I worked with an artist and I send them the mix or the master and they say they love it. And then I hear later, yeah, we weren't actually that happy with it, but we didn't want to say anything. I'm like, why not? You're paying me for this. So now every time I work with a client, once they sign off on the final mix or master or whatever it is that I'm delivering to them, I set a reminder, and 1 week later I hit them up. I'm just like, hey, are you still happy with this? Let me know. Like, I'm happy to make any changes. If you've had a week and you think there's something that needs a little tweaking, I'm not going to restart the whole thing from scratch, but if you want, hey, can you bring up the vocals 3 decibels here? I'm like, that is no problem, because I want you to be happy, and I don't want you to think like, hey, he's going to be upset if we go back and try to make a change. So be open to asking people to make changes. Don't be afraid that you're going to upset somebody. This is your art. You have the right to say, hey, can you make this adjustment, please? I don't think anyone would fault you for that. And if they do, that's not a good person to be working with.
Well, that's when we recorded our debut full-length album with Paul, there were specific things that Jesse was asking for. And he was saying like, hey, can we try this? And after Jesse had asked like 4 or 5 different things, and Paul was going through mixing changes and whatnot, he just kind of leaned back in his chair and he's like, you know, man, I'm trying things that I've never tried before. Which, to hear that coming from somebody who had literally recorded people on tape, like in his basement when he was like 15, it's like, that's pretty impressive to have, you know, like 25 years of audio engineering under your belt on 8-track and tape and, you know, vinyl and for you to say, oh, I'm trying things that I've never tried before. I'm doing things in ways that I never thought of. And it was both really refreshing to hear because we could kind of see that it made Paul a little more excited. It kind of made Paul a little more excited because it now was no longer what he was doing every day for the last 25 years. You know, now it was like, oh, well, let me see what kind of like new tips and tricks I can do. And then consequently, you know, when we sent off that album to be listened to by a whole bunch of people were just like, wow, sonically, this is some of the best producing I've ever heard. And it was so cool because it's like, wow, we had this guru who just by us asking a few things, it was kind of able to like light a little bit of like excitement in his life. So instead of him like sticking to his guns and doing exactly what he thought was going to be the objectively best way to produce an album, he tried new things. And in turn, he was just like, wow, this is really cool. I'm really happy that I did that. And, you know, which in turn probably made it so we got a better product in the end. You know, who knows for sure, because we don't know what the product would have been without it. But the fact that we tried, it made all of us feel like the producer that we chose was integrated into our project. That's really all you can do. That's what the music industry is finding a team of people who are integrated with the project that you are pursuing, you know, whether that's your bandmates, your producers, your marketing teams, your label. You don't ever want to work with somebody who doesn't want to be on fire about your project. If they don't want to be on fire about your project, then they don't want to be a part of your project. If they don't want to be a part of your project, then they shouldn't be a part of your project. So this kind of all actually ties into my last point about going into the studio. You need to have fun. And this is something it's like a mantra that I tell myself too. Because like my bandmates know that I do not enjoy going into the studio. And so we try as hard as we can to make things exciting, you know, and whether that's just like simple things like all going to lunch together while you're in the studio, hanging out together, watching videos together, you know, listening to music together after you've tracked a song. If you're staying in the studio, which a lot of people do, sometimes you'll be able to go and listen to the song after your producer's gone home for the night. And then you might be able to come up with post-production ideas. Or maybe it's like, I've literally been listening to this music for 2 days straight. I'm miserable and I don't want to listen to it anymore. Then maybe it's time for you guys to go see a movie together. There's all sorts of things that you can do, and it's about having fun. It's about the experience start to finish. So whatever you have to do in order to like make that time better, do it. Have people that care about you and find whatever way works best for you to conquer your anxieties. And who knows, maybe you and I do not share any of the same stresses of the studio. Maybe you're like a guitarist and you're just phenomenal. Like I remember watching the guitarist from The Air I Breathe just nail one of his like super nutso solos first take. There are people like that. My drummer, we have tried very, very hard to make the studio more enjoyable for our drummer because he's such a good drummer that he will literally knock out an entire album in one day. No problem. He's done it on multiple occasions, which really sucks for him when he comes to the studio for 2 weeks because then he literally does everything day one and then he sits around and twiddles his thumbs. And he doesn't necessarily care too much about like whether or not I go up or I go down on this vocal line. And so a lot of the time what we've done is we've separated his drumming days into like 2 or 3 days. So that way he doesn't just come in on day one and then he's gone. The longer he's there and doesn't do work, the less he wants to be there, the less integrated he is. So you want to bring people in, you got to figure out what works best for you. And who knows, maybe coming in and knocking it all out in one day is the magic. But in my experience, I've been in the studio by myself, I've been in the studio with one other person, and I've been in the studio with my entire band. And it's always, always, always a better time when my entire band is there, when we're all there pursuing what we're passionate about.
Yeah, I feel like that sense of camaraderie really makes a huge difference. And I want to toss something out there too, because you mentioned going into the studio and, you know, you grab lunch or you go see a movie. you should all, as a band, do that even when you're not in the studio. Just like have a once a month thing where it's like, hey, we're going to go do something fun together. We're not going to talk about band stuff. We're just going to have a good time and hang out. Because that will make the band that much tighter and will help you make better music and better business decisions as your career progresses. That does it for this episode of the Bandhive Podcast. And I just wanted to reiterate how glad I am to have Matt Hose back on the show after his time away in the studio with his band Alive in Barcelona. As much as I love having guests on the show, and we will have more guests in the future, it is also very nice to have somebody that you have on the show every single week and you can bounce ideas back and forth and have a discussion, and there's that rapport already built up. That is super awesome. And I just want to throw this out there. Matt and I both offer coaching for artists through Bandhive. So if you are looking for some advice or some kind of structure, or just don't know exactly what you should be doing with your band, head on over to bandhive.rocks/coaching to fill out our application and sign up for coaching with either one of us. We'll look at your application and see if you're a good fit, and then we'll figure out which one of us is the best coach for your situation, depending on what your needs are and how that fits in with our expertise. So again, that's bandhive.rocks/coaching. Head on over now to apply. Aside from that, we will be back with another new episode next Tuesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then, I hope you have an awesome week, stay safe, and of course, as always, keep rocking.